Abu Hamid al-Ghazali's Ihya Ulum translated as the revival or resuscitation of the religious sciences, is one of the most important works in the history of the Islamic intellectual tradition. But more than that, I would argue that it's one of the most impressive and important works in all of the Abrahamic religious traditions. It belongs with Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica, Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed, or a whole host of other important theological, philosophical, ethical, and spiritual texts. And yet, unfortunately, especially for those of us outside of the Islamic tradition, this text and the work of al-Ghazali is not nearly as well known as it should be. Part of that has to do with the fact that Ghazali is much more well known in Western philosophy through his commentaries on Aristotle, as well as his critiques of the philosophers. These critiques of the philosophers have led to a number of accusations against al-Ghazali, that he's a fideist that rejects any rational inquiry, that he is the reason for the decline of philosophical and scientific discovery and interest in the broader Islamic societies. These are far from accurate, but unfortunately remain dominant. So what I want to do in this series of quarantine videos is try to engage in a basic introduction to some of the main themes in the first book of Ghazali's magnus opus, The Revival of the Religious Sciences. What we'll be looking at is this introductory book called the Kitab al-Ilm, or the Book of Knowledge, in which Ghazali lays out his vision for why he's writing the book, as well as the importance and limits of knowledge. How do we come to know? How do we come to follow after God? What are the importances of jurisprudence, of philosophy, of spiritual practices, and in theology in the pursuit of God, or what he often calls of as the sciences of the hereafter? In order to understand, however, the aims and reasons for Ghazali writing this text, it's important to know at least a little bit about Ghazali's own story. Ghazali was born in the year 1058 Western calendar, or 450 in the Islamic calendar, in the city of Tus, which is in the eastern part of what is now Iran. During his childhood, he was given the opportunity, despite not coming from a wealthy family, to begin to study, and he was earned quite a good reputation as a scholar and as a learner. He eventually began and moved out of Tus and was able to study under the great Imam al-Juwayni, one of the most important Sunni philosophers and theologians and jurists of his period, and was taken to become the star student. In the year 1085, after Juwayni's death, Ghazali began to have increasing fame. Finally, in the year 1092, he was put in charge and appointed as the professor of jurisprudence and theology by the caliph in the city of Baghdad. He achieved a great deal of acclaim. However, in the year 1095, he abandoned all of this power, prestige, and honor and began a life as an itinerant, seeking out theological, spiritual knowledge, moving into places like Damascus, Jerusalem, and eventually going on pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina. We know a lot of this story because Ghazali, like Augustine, wrote something like a spiritual autobiography. But like Augustine's Confessions, al-Ghazali's deliverance from error is not exactly just an autobiography. It's a staged work of theological and spiritual reflection that not only tells al-Ghazali's own story, but invites the reader to follow after God in following after al-Ghazali. And in fact, it's important to understand that because the introduction to al-Ghazali's Ihya also importantly reflects on questions of the place of knowledge as it relates to worldly power and worldly affairs. And in fact, al-Ghazali sets out in the introduction to the entire work his reasons for writing this book. In writing the book, he argues that he has come to realize that the world that he lives in, the society that he lives in, despite being the so-called golden age of Islam, lacks any proper religious knowledge. Why? Not because the Hadith and the Quran have disappeared, not because there aren't a whole host of mutakallimun or theologians, ulama or jurists, philosophers. They're in fact proliferating all over. But that many of these theologians, jurists, and philosophers have become so engaged in disputation, in worldly affairs and seeking out power, that they have forgotten the central place and role of their work, not to be ends in of themselves, to be part of the science of the hereafter, of journeying people towards God. Let me read a text from this author's introduction of the entire work. He argues that there is no reason for the consistent disapproval because he has looked around and, quote, the next life is approaching. The present world is vanishing. Death is imminent. The journey is far. Provisions for the journey are scant. The dangers are great, and the road is blocked. The perceptive know that only knowledge and works devoted to God avail. But however, with neither guide nor companion, the journey on the road to the next life, with its many pitfalls, is difficult and tiring. So in fact, he argues and sets out that this entire project of the Ahia is to provide something like a guide on this journey to the hereafter, to revive the religious sciences, not for their own sake, but for the sake of serving on the journey to the path to God. And he does this through a book, an entire project that is divided into 4 parts. The quarter, or 10 books of one part, on worship, a quarter, or on 10 parts, on customs. These first 2 are focused on what he considers external actions, or external knowledge. The second half, which is again divided into a quarter on the perils of life, and then a quarter on deliverance, are focused on the inward heart. So in these you have things like the gratitude, the virtue of patience and gratitude, or trust in divine unity, or on the ailments of the heart. So he divides these into 2 different sections. And the aim is to walk you through not only external actions, praying, fasting, marriage, divorce, pilgrimage, but also to think about how these texts might relate to the inward journey, the journey of the seeker who goes after God. But what's important to understand for the Ahia is that al-Ghazali argues that none of this can actually touch on the most central issue, which is the unveiling of the heart before God. So throughout this entire project, as I'll get to the next few days or weeks, however long this takes, Ghazali emphasizes the importance of things like jurisprudence, ritual action, knowledge of the Hadith and the Quran. But he also recognizes that these are only important insofar as they serve the aim of the journey towards God, towards what we might even call a mystical unveiling of the text. One of the other things that I find really interesting about Ghazali's textbook is that he often, introduction to this entire book, is that he offers a strong critique of especially jurisprudence and scholars of the day, arguing that instead of seeking religious knowledge, seeking true wisdom, they're seeking out of worldly acclaim. And in fact, he argues that he has set up the entire book in this 4 quartets, not simply in order to walk you through both outward and inward knowledge and practice, not simply to address the wide range of both personal customs, interpersonal customs, theology, and spiritual practices, but also to trick people. This is an interesting thing. He thinks that, in fact, he's arranged it to look just like a fiqh textbook, to look like a legal handbook, so that some legal scholar or young academic who's scrolling through the book saying, how can I learn about jurisprudence? How can I learn about the Islamic sciences? Will see a book by the eminent scholar, former professor, on the revival of the religious sciences that looks to be exactly like a fiqh textbook. They'll pick it up thinking that they'll get worldly gain. But in fact, what they'll have has been ensnared into a journey to the hereafter. A journey that begins, for Ghazali, with understanding the importance and limits of knowledge, the issue that we'll turn to in our next video.